Ben Riggs presents Reading D&D Aloud. Episode 32, Appendix N in Dungeon Crawl Classics with James Lowder.
Welcome once again, one and all, to Reading Dungeons and Dragons Aloud. I am apparently controversial Dungeons and Dragons historian Ben Riggs, and I am here today with TSR alum Jim Lowder. Jim, what would you say is your most distinctive work?
Oh, wow. From the TSR era, I'd say probably Prince of Lies, though more people have read Night of the Black Rose.
Okay. So obviously you were a TSR author, and since then you've been doing a lot of freelance editing. You had a second career at Chaosium. Is there anything else you think is important from your career that I didn't mention?
Oh, well, I mean, my career since TSR has been largely kind of living in that space between gaming and fiction and comics, the transmedia space. Uh, Even the time that I worked at Chaosium was actually helping processes and standards and doing the sort of professional training stuff that I spend a lot of my time on. Um, Quite a lot of what I do these days is creator rights and creator education for Gamma and uh, Tabletop Game Designers Association, and just being a general thorn in the side of the industry as far as creator rights go.
You are the first person to be on the show twice, so thank you.
Oh,
Uh,
thanks for asking.
and Today we are going to read a section from the Dungeon Crawl Classics core book that really struck me because it was the first time that I really encountered Appendix N, because I came in at into D&D at second edition, and maybe there was an Appendix N in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but I didn't get to it, and it did not have the status that the Appendix N in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide has acquired. Um, but with that, I think I'm going to launch in and just let everything else be explained by Joseph Goodman here. You want to say anything else, Jim?
No, Appendix N has had a huge impact on the game and a huge impact on the players around the time, when the DM's guide was first released, and so it's not a shock that list still looms large over the hobby.
All right, then I'm going to get to it. But again, feel free to interrupt me anytime here. So this is from, I believe, page 242 of Dungeon Crawl Classics, and it's titled Appendix N, Inspirational Reading. In the 1979 publication of the AD&D DMG, the last entry before the glossary is Appendix N, in which Gary Gygax lists the fantasy and sci-fi novels that inspired his work on the game. This oft-ignored bibliography has received renewed attention in recent years. It is in fact one of the foundations on which fantasy role-playing was built. Reading the books referenced by Gygax, one understands three important facts. First, that D&D was not spawned from the imagination wholly formed, but was in fact an incremental iteration of literary mechanism, one more step in a march begun by Burroughs, Lovecraft, Vance, and Howard many decades prior. A very important step, true, but nonetheless an evolution. Second, that many, and then we have parentheses here, many exclamation point, of the conventions of D&D are not in fact unique, but share a clear and cogent ancestry with the books named in Appendix N, and the resulting game of D&D can be easily seen not as a brilliant creation, but as a brilliant integration of the best fantasy conventions from a wide variety of sources. Read the books in Appendix N to feel the mental click as you understand why some part of D&D is the way it is. Spells, classes, races, combat mechanics, and so on. The
Look,
third, go for it.
there are two things from there that deserve and maybe three. Um, you can see where this discussion, you sort of skip a rail here, because you start off talking about D&D as sort of this literary creation, and then you shift in point two here to the fact that it's a game, and that's a common mistake, and actually one that I used to make a lot too. D&D is not a group storytelling game. D&D, it's not a narrative fiction form. It's something new. That was the brilliant part of it. It's gamified storytelling. So it isn't a direct linear progression from any of these literary sources, because it's a different form. So what the game does is very, very different from what a narrative story does. And it's important to sort of flag that early on in this. It's also notable to think that, these are the best possible sources. As a list, Appendix N has a lot of great stuff in it, but it ignores a huge amount of material. And as a possible source for a game, it's limited, which brings around to that last point in point two. Yes, he's absolutely correct. This is why spells and races and classes look the way they do, because they're drawn from what in the end amounts to a very narrow subset of pulp and pulp era storytelling and secondary world fantasy that had a bunch of strengths to it, but also a bunch of weaknesses. And the game ends up modeling both.
Well, and when you're talking about uh, books that are important to D&D that are not in Appendix N, I'm going to steal from Joseph Laycock here and say immediately the Bible. Um, like if you're going to talk about a work that was clearly influential in the game that Gygax didn't put there, it's got to be the Bible, and it's so funny given the game's history and how religious panickers uh, campaigned against the game, that so much of Christianity is just implicit in D&D.
Oh, and sure, and that's implied too when you start looking at Tolkien and some of the other works that are in here too, that are also heavily influenced by this earlier tradition. That this is the books on the Appendix N are a lot of secondary world created fantasy from the early 20th century through the pulp era, and then by the time you start to get to like Moorcock, people who were influenced by that, and then are, Moorcock started off writing Tarzan adventures and things like that, and did, pastiche stuff, but then rework that into a broader, more liberal vision for what Moorcock especially was writing. The same thing with a lot of the Zelazny stuff. But all of these are influenced by earlier works that are left off. So we don't get the Gothic tradition referenced in this, and the Gothic tradition is part of all of this. You don't get the fairy tale tradition. You don't get the romances. Mallory should be listed in here right up front, right, with Mallory and Tennyson, because the Arthurian material looms large over what paladins are and what D&D is.
I want to take a second to mention here when Goodman talks about how D&D is not a brilliant creation, but a brilliant integration of the best fantasy conventions from a wide variety of sources. So I am working on a book on fifth edition, and I've decided to, start in the sexiest place and work back from that. So I'm working on my OGL chapters, and I've been interviewing a lot of people, and I recently went over the proposed OGL 1.1 that leaked and blew up the internet. I went over that with a fine-tooth comb, and at Hasbro slash Wizards, there was deep and abiding concern about the fact that the OGL had let so much of their intellectual property out into the world. But when you consider that so much of D&D is not original to D&D, but is in fact adapted from other sources,
Sure.
it would seem like if you actually, again, had a lawsuit about it and you were like, well, Law and Chaos, that's like a D&D thing. Well, no, it's not. It's from I think Three Hearts and Three Lions.
And from
Uh,
Moorcock.
and from Moorcock too. Um, so like, if push came to shove in front of a judge, would the judge really say that belongs to D&D when it has all these antecedents? And it would seem like not. So again, it's just interesting to read this in the context of me thinking about
Well,
intellectual property in the OGL. Please
no,
go ahead.
and the intellectual property part of this is huge, right? The Displacer Beast is derived from specific literary sources, right? And if you look at the history of pop fiction, you're seeing the transition from even, and Lovecraft is mentioned here, right? The Lovecraft circle and the mythos writers who were expanding and sharing all of these ideas and things that are just not covered by what we would now consider the standard intellectual property approach of walled off trademark and copyright and all the rest of it. The sharing throughout the pulps, then the sharing through the zines, which that's the from the game side, that's where Gary and Dave and the gaming groups come from, right? They're doing the same thing with gaming that the Lovecraft Mythos Circle and Moorcock and a lot of the other Weird Tales writers and the other people who are sharing things were doing through the 20s through the 50s and 60s. And then once you get to the 70s and 80s, things start getting walled off in intellectual property.
That's a
And
really, really good point.
you see that. I mean, that's the argument around Moorcock granting potentially dual permission for Chaosium and TSR to both do stuff with the game. Why can't everybody do it? Because that's coming out of that shared community idea of IP that ends very clearly once you start getting into the 80s and especially 90s. And now it's all about walling off intellectual property.
Wow. Um, all right, I'm going to keep going with the third fact you realize if you read all of Appendix N. Is that okay?
But by all means,
Okay, and again, interrupt any time. So
yep,
third and finally, that the type of fantastical adventure espoused by D&D, the quote spirit of the game, which many modern nostalgic gamers strive to invoke, is not achieved via specific game rules, but rather by any rules and any style of play that allows one to simulate the adventures of classic fantasy heroes. If your game can accurately accommodate the adventures of doomed Elric, grim Conan, clever Cudgel, spontaneous Harold Shea, Mary Fofford, and the Grey Mouser, daring Hawkmoon, if your game can do that, regardless of rules, you have achieved what Gygax and Arneson set out to do.
that's not accurate.
Yeah, please tell me more about that because I have some thoughts here too.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, the game rules are specifically set up to make those stories possible, which is why you have uh, races and classes and things like that, which are modeled after those sources. So you kind of you can't have it both ways. If you're designing your game rules to mirror and model certain types of stories, and this is not a broad story band, this is a narrow story band, uh, then the game rules matter. The game rules absolutely matter, and you see that in the type of stories that the D&D rules early on allowed you to tell, where you kill stuff and you take their gold and you get experience points and you get stronger and stronger, and you're Conan. You start off as a freebooter, you end up as a king. And that's sort of the model that the game rule supports. And bad guys are easily identifiable because all drow are lawful evil, and that's a very limited storytelling model.
Yeah,
It
I
doesn't
find
work,
this one. Sorry, go ahead.
and it doesn't work for Lovecraft, right? Who's also on the list. That the D&D rules don't work for Lovecraftian cosmic horror. That's why Call of Cthulhu works the way it does, because the more you adventure, the more you're punished. You learn more things, and your character arc is downward, not upward, which is what the D&D model is. And we ran into this when we were working on the Ravenloft box set, and how do you handle horror and things like that in the D&D setting. in a way that's different from that negative modeling cosmic horror that you get with Call of Cthulhu.
One of the formative gaming experiences I had in the last year was running the One Ring role playing game, and I'm running it with a bunch of mid 40s dudes and one woman under 30, and all of us mid 40s dudes are just like, oh, new rules. God, it's like putting on a pair of starched underwear that doesn't quite fit right, and we're all kind of like grumpy about it. And yet, at the table, you get this like I'm watching the movies feeling, which was remarkable. Like it was remarkable that that was the aesthetic experience that those rules and procedures evoked in us. And I am like, well, we're not changing the rules, like because this is working. We're not going to mess with the rules.
Right.
So to hear him again, it's a really weird paragraph where he's like, the rules don't matter as long as you get this aesthetic experience that you want at the end. But it's like,
Well,
but
but
the rules seem to generate those.
right, exactly. Well, right, and that's where the clash is, because the modern expectations, and you see this in fifth and the new edition of D&D, the modern expectations are the game won't get in the way of the story you're trying to tell, and that's where you get rules like scheme and all of the different approaches to minimal rules to maximum rules. The big honking traditional rule books to things like Cats of Cthulhu, where the rules are very streamlined and you can figure them out in about 10 minutes. And they model different types of games. And so you can tell any story with any rule set if you beat it hard enough with a hammer and ignore the encumbrance table and ignore there's certain kinds of things that are written down. But the rule sets as written encourage certain types of play.
All right. This author highly recommends returning to these primary sources for inspiration. When writing the Dungeon Crawl Classics role-playing game, I did not set out to create a retro clone in the OSR sense, nor did I intend to create a D20 clone in the OGL sense. My goal was to create a game that resembled and enabled the adventures I read in Appendix N. As a precursor and subsequent companion to the writing of this manuscript, I set out to read the entirety of Appendix N. This is several years' work, and because many Appendix N authors wrote dozens of books, a project that never truly ends. But I did succeed in reading a prodigious supply of classic fantasy literature while authoring this work. I believe the resulting RPG successfully captures the spirit of the original game, using a wholly different rule set. You may question why rules for intelligent swords and planar travel are included in a low-level rule set, but referencing the primary sources reveals the answer. Below, you will find Gygax's original bibliography intact. While concepting and writing this manuscript, I read most of the list. All the books named by title, most, if not all, the books from the various specified series, e.g., Burroughs Mars series, and the generally acknowledged best works of authors who are listed with no corresponding title or series. For example, the Silver John series by Manly Wade Wellman. You will find that the DCC RPG rules easily accommodate any adventure from Appendix N. Having completed a self-directed literary survey of the authors on this list, I highly recommend reading the work of Howard, Lovecraft, Vance, Burroughs, Merritt, and Moorcock. And again, having run and played Dungeon Crawl Classics, I would you're right to quibble with Lovecraft. Like a lot of these adventures are Lovecraftianly themed
Right.
with like horrible horrors from beyond space. But you really couldn't do a Lovecraft adventure using these rules.
Right, and it's Lovecraftian, as in the stuff that crept into Howard for the non-straight mythos stories, and that's the difference between a horror adventure and a straight cosmic horror story. And and these rules are great for they do exactly what he says he is, what he's hoping to do here. For the majority of the works that he's trying to model, the rule set does a terrific job at that and lets you play those stories.
So he just listed a list of authors saying Reed Howard, Lovecraft, Vance, Burroughs, Merritt, and Moorcock. They are extraordinarily inspirational for the adventure author and give direct insight to the origins of fantasy role-playing. However, do not limit yourself. Start with them, then continue through all of Appendix N. Doing so will strengthen your understanding of the game. Vance is critical to understanding the D&D magic system. You'll read descriptions of classic D&D spells in a work written 20 years before D&D was published, as are DeCamp and Pratt, whose Adventures of Harold Shea describe many D&D magic conventions. The original D&D Thief class is an amalgam of characters presented by Fritz Leiber, Robert E. Howard, and Jack Vance. The original D&D Paladin comes from Poul Anderson. The D&D alignment system is derived from Poul Anderson and Michael Moorcock. The rules for magic swords and much of the inspiration for planar travel comes from Michael Moorcock, with additional planar travel concepts clearly visible in Roger Zelazny and P.J. Farmer, and at a conceptual level in Edgar Rice Burroughs as well. Many monsters and elements of spellcasting are visible in Lovecraft. The concepts of drow and Underdark adventures derive from Merritt and St. Clair, and so on.
But they're also, and this is the thing that misses. Those are also, the drow are also being derived, filtered through those pulp authors from other traditional sources and from myths and German legends and all sorts of things that don't show up on this list. This is showing a distillation of those larger things down to that narrow pulp band.
Yeah, and until you mentioned it, I had never considered before the works that should have been on Appendix N and are not, which is a really interesting thing.
Well, I mean, it's not that they shouldn't be on there. It's that they had an influence over D&D that isn't part of the conscious modeling that's going on that Gary was doing with these. Because when Gary's trying to, and Dave as well, and both the Minnesota and the Wisconsin groups, when they're putting together what they're hoping the game will do, these are the stories they have in mind. And they don't have to be conscious of where Mallory is coming in from this. These are the ones like, Goodman here with what he's trying to do with the rule set as well, trying to create a game that will allow them to tell very specific selections from this narrow band of storytelling.
All right, I'm going to keep going. The most powerful trait of Appendix N, insofar as influencing fantasy adventuring, is what I call, quote, pre-genre storytelling, end quote. In the current era, all gamers, many laymen, have preconceptions of fantasy archetypes. One knows what an elf is, one knows what an elf is like, and what a dwarf is like, and what powers a dragon or vampire should have. Most of the authors in Appendix N, however, were writing before fantasy was an acknowledged literary category. The conception of an elf, as expressed in Tolkien, is now common knowledge, but the elves described by Lord Dunsany and Poul Anderson were completely different creatures. The same is true of
Not really true.
Say it again?
That's not really true. That's not really the case. Because Dunsany and Tolkien were drawing from the same well. They're drawing on the fairy stories and Morris and other things coming before all of that. And these stories, the things that we're talking about here on this list, aren't really pre-genre; they're pre-commercial genre, and that's a different thing. I mean, Dunsany and the earliest works on Appendix N were the people who formed the idea of secondary world fantasy as a storytelling genre. But when you start getting into even the 1920s and 1930s with the pulps, that's already a commercially defined genre. Weird Tales was marketed as Weird Tales because you had a scope of stories you were expecting to see in there. The same thing with the other fantasy pulps and the other people that are working in those. They might have had a broader range than some of the commercial fantasy genre definitions now, but that's not to say they weren't clearly genre works. What he's talking about when you start saying, well, by the 70s and 80s, when you're talking about Brooks and things, those are the genre conventions have solidified by that point, and you have marketing aimed very specifically at giving those works to an audience, putting them in a very defined part of the bookstore, marketing them in certain ways in certain channels to reach an audience that is looking for that type of work. And
Yeah.
so yeah, so that's a different it's a different idea of genre. I mean, all of it, the fantastic, all of it goes back in a lot of these works before Dunsany and the pulps. Uh, those were just considered part of literature. They were just they were literary works, and the fantastic could be part of them. It's the creation of the secondary world fantasy in it became a big deal because then that allowed the sort of commercial definition that we see where uh, Middle Earth is a place and Shannara is a place and a brand and a breakfast cereal eventually. So and that's where you see the change over the decades from the 50s and 60s, kind of where this ends, to the late 60s, 70s, where you've got the Ballantine Adult Fantasy series, which reprinted some of the works on here. But by the time you get into the 70s with Brooks, it's a whole different marketing driven genre because of the commercial interest.
Yeah, and I thought he was going to work up to genre fluidity here, but having read a couple sentences ahead,
Right.
it looks like not. Let me finish the paragraph really quick.
Yep.
The same. So, and he said, an elf is now common knowledge, but what Dunsany and Poole Anderson had were different than the elves that we think of. Um, the same is true of dozens of other fantasy conceits. When you read Appendix N, fantasy once again becomes fantasy. The concepts escape modern classifications. And I would say that the elf there is a very interesting choice of example because, again, Tolkien was just so good and so powerful that I feel like he took the word and it now means what he meant when he said it, right? Like,
Right.
a modern elf is some sort of immortal being who's beautiful and young forever. And that's what an elf is. And Dunsany, the elves were more like fairies a lot of the time, as I recall.
Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah, the King of Elfland's daughter,
yeah.
and those they're drawing from the same traditions. They're just amplifying and selecting specific traits to cement. And Tolkien had such a massive impact over the genre that's become the convention, which is how genres work, right? I mean, it's what you're saying about fluidity. They'll change over time, and now as you get writers commenting on and redefining elves from Tolkien to be not Tolkien elves, uh, that then allows the genre to progress and expand and create more interesting works rather than just the same stultified, narrow definitions
Yeah.
over.
Let me continue. In a sense, the Dungeon Crawl Classics role-playing game is not an attempt to model an experience related to D&D, but rather an attempt to model the experience that predated D&D. This game is pre-D&D Swords and Sorcery. You are holding the rules that let you experience the same sense of adventure that Gygax and Arneson experienced while they were first developing the game. I find this to be a very strange sentiment. Um, so he says that this is a rule set designed to first of all, I really do appreciate the fact that he is like, how do I inspire this aesthetic experience
Right.
in the players of the game. I find that a very interesting place to start.
Oh yeah,
Um,
this is yeah, and I agree with you. This is a it's a fascinating, thoughtful way to approach how you design the game because it's going toward that player experience. And what do I want the players to take away from this? And now I'm trying to create a game to do that. That's a great way to approach it.
it's weird to me though that he's like, these rules will let you experience the same sense of adventure that Gygax and Arneson experienced while they were first developing the game. It's a little strange to me that like he's like, well, I have new rules that will help you experience the first thing that they felt. Um, I don't know if they wrote about how they felt.
No, and yeah, and well, and it's also willing suspension of disbelief. Can you, just as a player, as a gamer, can you pretend you've never played D&D and play this and pretend you've never played
Yeah,
D&D, which isn't really possible.
yeah. I
Um,
mean,
Good goal,
good.
but not necessarily something you can do.
Yeah,
The other part of that too is, look, every player that comes to the game, and this is something else that the idea of Appendix N and the idea of how the players interact with the rule set. If, like me, you came to D&D as you were playing for a while and had read Merwin Peake and Edison and a bunch of the other works in the Ballantine Adult Fantasy stuff, and you're trying to bring in Ellison and the Derney books and Le Guin and a bunch of people that aren't mentioned here, then your experience with the game is also going to be different. And the rule set will either support that or create clashes. So if you go into this, I'm specifically trying to play Three Hearts and Three Lions. Okay. But if your fantasy aesthetic or your storytelling aesthetic is drawing in from things wider than this, it's going to create conflict.
yeah. So let me keep going here. So he said that these rules are going to let you experience what Gygax and Arneson experienced when they were first developing the game, continuing where they had to dedicate their energies to creating rules never before devised by man. I have the luxury of drawing on 30 years of game design, and thus I dedicate my energies not to creating rules, but to conveying tone. Here, then, the tone of Appendix N. I love the voice here, but again, it's like a little weird because I'm like, well, the rules do set a very unique tone for Appendix N, or not for
Right?
Appendix N, for DCC. But okay, let me just keep going here, Joseph. Um, my journey down the road of pre-genre fiction brought me to two other fantasy authors I highly recommend. Clark Ashton Smith was a contemporary of Robert E. Howard and Lovecraft and an amazing author of horror-shadowed fantasy. His work is inspirational for anyone playing a wizard character, and there are some D&D historians who believe his omission from Appendix N was an accidental oversight on Gygax's part. William Hope Hodgson was one of Lovecraft's inspirations. His work deals primarily with seafaring stories and is sometimes considered supernatural horror rather than fantasy, but it is filled with the kind of adventures that make great D&D games. I actually picked up Clark Ashton Smith based on Joseph Goodman's recommendation. I wasn't a huge fan, but I'm also really
Oh, I
persnickety.
I am a huge. I Smith had actually a big influence on me as a writer too. The and Hodgson is known to a certain extent for the sea stories, but also the Nightland and House on the Borderland and a bunch of other things that are not really modeled over those same sorts of things. Nightland, you can actually do more of a D&D type, Dying Earth, Vancian thing. Um, House on the Borderland is a straight horror, Lovecraftian cosmic horror kind of thing that doesn't actually model well with D&D type rules. So, again, it's that idea of that narrow band. I do agree that Smith being left out of Appendix N is kind of a surprise.
Hmm. Let me continue. Additionally, there are certain films which simply must be viewed to properly understand the history of D&D. The first is The Raven, the original 1963 version starring Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, and Boris Karloff. Watch this film to understand the origins of many D&D spells. The spell duel sequence near the end is clearly an input to the D&D spell system, and certain players in the original Lake Geneva campaigns recall Gygax's fondness for this movie. Another indispensable film for the D&D historian is Horror of Dracula, starring Peter Cushing. Part of the Hammer horror series from the 1950s and 60s, this film is clearly an inspiration for the cleric's iconic ability to turn undead, and the series is known to be a favorite of Arneson's. One final note. Oh boy. Uh, I am a sesquipedalian, which I'm going to look that up right now. What is a sesquipedalian? Unless you know off the top of your head.
I don't.
Um, you'll be shocked to learn that it is a formal word, and it is a synonym for polysyllabic, characterized by long words, long-winded, the sesquipedalian prose of scientific journals. Okay, so wordy, liking big words. Bombastic is the word that I would use there. So, one final note. I am a sesquipedalian, and I suspect I am not alone among fans of Gygax's syntax and word choice. Inculcation of Appendix N and ratiocination in regard to vocabulary is concomitant to mellifluous and salubrious logophilia and a prerequisite to possession of a fantasy panduct. Okay, Joseph.
And there's well, yeah, that's the strange ululations and the non-Euclidean geometry of cyclopean blocks in Lovecraft.
It's your book. It's your book, man. It's your
Yep.
game. You're a lawyer. I assume you paid for this with your money. It's fine.
No, I mean, and no, I actually find that kind of charming. It's what he's doing is actually warning some of the people who hadn't read Clark Ashton Smith. You mentioned Smith. That's a great example. Smith likes his word choice, and some of these, especially the pre-commercial genre fantasy. When you go back and read Dunsany, uh, they're not necessarily looking at a mass market. So these are challenge. Some of these are challenging works.
And I generally, even though Gary, I feel that Gary's vocabulary and word choice has more to do with the fact that he didn't graduate from high school than anything else. Um, he must have, for being a really smart guy, have felt so less than for the rest of his life.
I don't
Um,
think. Well, I don't think that's. You can't speculate about that. I mean, that's what you can say from the work is that as somebody who was largely self-taught, Gary tapped into a lot of things that people with college degrees and formal training can read and enjoy and at least see what he's trying to get at. And so I think that's it. But once you can't speculate about personality for it.
oh, I mean, I have no problem doing that.
You would like to, right?
Doesn't mean I'm right, but
Yeah, exactly. There you go.
um,
But well, I mean, and the interesting thing was there one of the things that you can look at with this is there would have been, had Lorraine Williams at TSR not really still had that hate on for Gary. I raised the possibility back in the book department at one point of doing an Appendix N anthology because the book department was doing the fantastic and amazing stories collections. And I asked Mary Kirchhoff at one point, we could do an Appendix N anthology because these would all be reprints, and this would be, and it immediately died as a suggestion because Lorraine was not going to let that come out because this was Gary's list, right? And she didn't want to foreground Gary at all. But Peter Burbagal just recently got has published a terrific anthology of selections from the Appendix N stuff. And
Really?
yes, it just got a second printing and or a new printing. Absolutely fantastic book.
What was the editor's name?
Peter Burbagal.
Appendix N: The Eldritch Roots of Dungeons and Dragons.
He did a fantastic job.
I mean, and Vandermeer wrote the afterword. Wow.
Absolutely. Yep.
Huh.
Well worth tracking down.
Strange Attractor Press, February 23rd, 2021. I will put a link in the show notes.
Yep. And there's a new edition that just came out. I don't know if I think that one's still available. I ordered it direct from the publisher. I've got both editions. So
Because the cover looks great. I'm fascinated. And it only has 95 ratings on Amazon, so it's clearly not gotten all the love it perhaps deserves. Uh, so that's really, really interesting.
Yep.
All right. So I don't think I'm gonna read all of Appendix N here because that's the next thing he does is he basically copy and pastes Appendix N.
Right.
Um, but have you played or read Dungeon Crawl Classics?
I've read it. I haven't played it.
I have run it and I've played it and I've read it and it is a ton of fun. It is a wild time.
Yep.
And I would say, I don't know what uh I think that your initial observation that the medium is different than that of fantasy literature is really relevant here because having read a lot of this fantasy literature, I wouldn't say that Dungeon Crawl Classics makes me feel the way I feel when I read it, but it really gives me a unique uh play experience. Again, it's wild, it's deadly, it's crazy,
Right.
it's nutty, it's off the wall, which is, all of that is a ton of fun, right?
And I've seen
Um,
it. Right. I haven't played it myself, but I actually have seen people at conventions playing it. So I've seen it working in the wild, as it were. Uh, and that's it, right? I mean, and that's what the tool set is supposed to do. The tool set, the game rules, and this is the gamification of the storytelling, is supposed to allow you, as you're sitting around the table with your friends and the game master, to tell the type of story that he is overtly trying to let you tell with this. And as that, it's a terrific rule set that does exactly what he's hoping, what his stated goal is here to do.
yeah, and again, I read this and I get persnickety about little things here and there. Um, but again, Dungeon Crawl Classics is a really enjoyable game, and yeah, like I guess that is the appropriate place to end this is that it seems as though Joseph Goodman won the game that he was playing and writing this. He succeeded in achieving his goals.
Well, and the other parts of this where we were talking, the riffs that we were making off of, gamification, or is this a narrow band or a broad band of story selections in Appendix N? I mean, those are discussions that are only happening now more seriously because people are taking the art form of role-playing games more seriously. And so you see, and this is one of the fascinating things about, again, living in that space between role-playing games and fiction, is watching the two bounce off each other, even when intentional things are being done, like Ravenloft novels and Forgotten Realms novels, and things that I worked on both as a writer and an editor, where Jeff Grubb is bringing in P.G. Wodehouse into Azure Bonds, and then that becomes something that if you read Azure Bonds or you read Elaine Cunningham's material, and she's drawing in very specific Celtic myth material, that then expands the definition of the game, because you're reading this fiction that it's being sold to the game market, and then players want the game to actually model those stories too. So you can't have Lawful Evil Drow after you've read Bob Salvatore. Bob broke Drow immediately as the old Lawful Evil model for Drow, because Bob wanted to write, he was writing a sophisticated hero character where the definitions of race weren't going to work from the old first edition stuff. The same things happened with Artis Cimber, with the character who's been written up, I think, in 4 or 5 different classes over time by different people, as they've tried to translate the character from Ring of Winter into game stats, because the character isn't fitting into that box. So he's actually multi-class or changes classes or does all of these things, which now are standard kind of parts of the game, which makes perfect sense if you look at the way in which the broader literature has impacted how the game rules have been bent to allow those types of stories to be modeled.
I feel like I guess my other closing thought is uh, for the last year, I have been obsessing over the aesthetic experience of the role-playing game. Because again, this One Ring campaign made such an impression on me. And like I played a lot of Star Wars D6 back in the day, and I absolutely loved it. But I wouldn't say it felt exactly like being in the movies. And this felt much more like being in the movies for some reason. Um, so to read Joseph Goodman here and read that he was really interested in the aesthetic experience that he was going to provoke in his players makes me feel a little bit less at sea with my
Right.
obsession.
Well, I mean, and that's a change for how, as people, we've had 50 years now to work with this art form, and people are starting, or people have over the years done more deliberate decisions on what the rule system looks like because they have that end play experience in mind.
So, how can people who find you fascinating, erudite, and nigh Gygaxian, how can they contribute to your financial well-being?
Well, I've got all kinds of various and sundry things. The latest game design was a scenario for Cats of Cthulhu, which was quite an experience going and writing a scenario for a rules light game. And otherwise, I'm working on various and sundry short fiction and all kinds of stuff.
Very cool.
If you check me out on Facebook or Blue Sky, I'll post about new works there.
Yeah, I am. I'm still posting things to Facebook and Blue Sky, but I am migrating to Blue Sky.
Yeah,
It
same
is the
same here.
decision I have made.
Yep.
So, if you are a regular listener, I have some good news, and that is that Scott and I are going to be recording reading the Dungeon Master's Guide aloud tomorrow. So we will have a new episode of that up. We are, however, going to post it to the Patreon exclusively, since Scott can really only find the time to do this once a month. We have decided to put it up there on Patreon. So if you love hearing me and Scott talk, you'll have to pay us $3 a month to do it from now on. The mere price of a cup of coffee. So please go forth to Patreon. And if you're hearing this on November 24th, 2024, or after, our latest episode of us talking should be up there. Other than that, next week we will be dark because it is the week of Thanksgiving here in America and we don't drop on holidays. But then I am working on a series on the wish spell where I'm trying to get designers from as many editions as possible to come on and talk about the wish spell in their edition. And even even the fourth edition guys, I'm going to try and have somebody come on, even though there is no wish in fourth edition, which blew my mind.
Which is sort of appropriate.
I know, it's so perfect. Like it's an encapsulation of everything,
Of
like
everything
right there.
With fourth edition right there.
Yeah, like, well, we can't do it. It breaks the game, And I mean, they're right. It does break the game. I'm sure it'll come down to that, but uh, so that should be coming up after our Thanksgiving holiday. Thank you all for having stuck through us through our the weeks that we were not posting and kind of figuring out where we were going. And thank you all for your continued support. It's been an amazing 8 months doing this podcast. Thank you so much. And Jim, thank you for taking the time out to talk to me.
Well, thanks again for having me.
All right, you have a good night, Jim.
You too.